On a humid morning in Abuja, before the sun reached its peak, a convoy of DSS security vehicles rolled to a stop outside the Federal High Court. The car doors swung open, and from within, surrounded by armed guards, Nnamdi Kanu, the man the regime hoped the world would forget, stepped out. His wrists were shackled, but his eyes didn't drop. He didn't look at the judge, not at the reporters. He looked into the crowd. What the cameras missed was clenched in his sweat-dampened palm, a single crumpled page, folded and worn from nights of writing by dim light. One page yet enough to tremble a continent. Days earlier, from a place few could reach, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso had sent a letter to Kanu, not cloaked in diplomacy or empty reassurances, but carved in conviction. Traoré's words had pierced through the bars and beyond the silence, awakening something that no lawyer, no envoy, no prayer had touched. And today Kanu replies, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with a message cloaked in quiet resistance smuggled through shadows, meant not for judges but for millions asleep in the illusion of freedom. The courtroom is a stage, the legal process a performance, but in the palm of a shackled man lies a weapon more feared than any protest, a truth too powerful to control. The question now is, can truth escape before the chains tighten further, or will we continue living inside a prison, draped in words like stability, security, and national unity? The courtroom was a theater of monotony. Lawyers droned on, judges murmured delays, and cameras lingered on Nnamdi Kanu's gaunt face. But no lens caught what mattered most. No reporter noticed the heat dripping from his clenched fist, nor the thin edge of paper folded into a weapon of defiance. A single page, ink smudged from sleepless nights, too fragile to matter until it did. At precisely 10:46 a.m., a subtle wave of disruption rippled through the chamber. A clerk dropped a file. A security guard turned his head. Someone in the back coughed too loud. Chaos, no. A distraction choreographed with precision. Kanu moved. Just slightly. He bent down, pretending to adjust his sandals. The guards barely blinked. But beneath that subtle shift, history pivoted. His fingers slipped the paper beneath the courtroom barrier, a motion so fluid it could have been mistaken for dust falling. And across from him, row 3, seat 5, a woman lowered her gaze beneath a beige hijab. To most she was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But to Kanu she was the courier, a former poet's translator from Enugu, now risking her name, her life, her future for a single message. The exchange took less than a second, a flick of fingers, a whisper of cloth, and the letter was gone, hidden beneath folds of linen and pressed against a racing heart. No alarm sounded, no one screamed, but something irreversible had just occurred. Outside the courtroom, DSS agents lined the exits. Tension sizzled like wires under current. Someone whispered through an encrypted line, "We think something's been passed." No specifics, no visuals, just a hunch. But in the world of secrets, a hunch is a loaded gun. The woman didn't panic. She didn't run. She moved with the tide of spectators' footsteps, measured eyes low. At the gate, an officer extended a hand. "Step aside, madam." Her breath caught. But behind her, a commotion exploded. A child began crying. A man yelled about a stolen wallet. Others surged forward. In the blur of confusion, she shifted left, ducked behind a stationary bus, and vanished. By the time DSS regrouped, she was blocks away, pulling a hoodie over her head in the back seat of a taxi that had been waiting all morning. The driver said nothing. He was paid not to ask. In her lap, the letter now rested in a metal case. Destination Niamey, then Ouagadougou, then the world. But the real version, a digital twin, was already airborne, uploaded via secure relay, bouncing across encrypted servers, hidden in basements from Lagos to Bamako. In less than 90 minutes, it would reach a dark room beneath the presidential compound of Burkina Faso to the hands of the one man who dared to write first, Ibrahim Traore. Back in Aso Rock, tension boiled over. President Tinubu's inner circle convened an emergency call. "Something is out," one aide whispered. Screens flickered with grainy footage, AI facial scans. But the woman's face, it never appeared again. She was a ghost now. One advisor hesitated, then muttered, "What if it was a letter?" Silence. They all remembered Traoré's first letter, the one that dared speak Kanu's name aloud. The one they tried to erase before it ignited more. Now they feared the worst. A response had been sent. Not just words, but a spark. And that spark was no longer inside any prison. The letter didn't begin with anger. It began with silence, compressed, restrained, and ready to explode. Nnamdi Kanu wasn't writing as a prisoner. He was writing as a man who looked into a mirror and didn't just see himself, but an entire continent staring back. He called the name of the man who had awakened him Ibrahim Traore. No titles, no diplomacy, just brother. In the opening lines, Kanu wrote, "They couldn't imprison your words. They couldn't erase my name. When you dared to speak of me without shame, you did the most dangerous thing possible. You acknowledged I exist." The words were simple, but echoed like thunder through stone. Ibrahim Traore hadn't just written a letter to a detained man. He had resurrected a forgotten voice. And Kanu didn't thank him, he answered him. Kanu's letter dismantled the myths of history polished by modern politics. He didn't talk about rebellion. He talked about betrayal, about the agony of being erased from maps drawn in foreign ink. He wrote Biafra wasn't born of revolt. It was born of refusal to vanish. We didn't ask to leave. We asked to remain. They answered with bullets, with famine, with silence. There was no apology for dreaming, no denial of wounds, yet no hatred either. That's what turned this letter into a political document, not just a prisoner's lament. In one of its most powerful segments, Kanu wrote directly about Ibrahim Traore. "If Thomas Sankara had lived to choose an heir, I don't believe it would have been a man in a Western suit, but one who wears the dust of his people like armor. A man like you." Kanu didn't paint Traoré as a savior. He honored him as a witness who refused to be silent. That is what threatens the current order, a leader who writes to the imprisoned not out of pity, but to stand beside them. Throughout the letter, Ibrahim Traoré was not the center, but the spark. Kanu invoked his name, like Sankara's, not as a prophet, but as proof that fire is still possible. They'll beg you to soften your voice for diplomacy's sake. If that fails, they'll turn your allies against you. They'll wear your flag while selling your name. Then came the promise. They cannot kill the dream, because now the dream wears your face. Kanu didn't just uplift, he exposed. He tore apart the performative alliances. ECO was the governments tied to foreign coins, the organizations of unity that stay silent when blood spills. But even in despair, the tone never crumbled into hopelessness. On the contrary, the letter radiated a steel-bound conviction that truth cannot be locked away forever. He declared, "I don't write this to glorify death. I write this to affirm that I am still alive, and I am still writing." Toward the end, Kanu's voice turned outward, not to himself, but to the people, to the youth who had never heard his name, but who would now hear it because of Ibrahim Traore. "If I disappear, don't let the world fall silent. Tell them I answered." The letter wasn't merely delivered, it was unleashed. Within 48 hours of leaving Nnamdi Kanu's palm, a digitized version of the letter had crossed borders, leapt satellites, and landed in a dim war room beneath the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, where Ibrahim Traore stood among student leaders, unionists, ex-soldiers, and mothers of the disappeared. He didn't sit, he stood. The paper trembled slightly in his calloused hands, and when he began to read, the room froze in reverent silence. Nigeria is not a country. It is a cage with a national anthem. The sentence struck like lightning across silence. Soldiers who had fought terrorists, mothers who had buried sons, students expelled for speaking out, they didn't flinch. They listened, word by word, wound by wound, until truth became something no longer deniable. And when Traoré reached the final line, "The fire lives in you now, Ibrahim." He folded the letter, set it gently on the table, and said, "This is no longer about one prisoner. It's about all of us." The next morning there was no broadcast, no press release, just an image, a hand holding a single line, written in bold, "Tell them I answered." It spread like a virus of awakening. In Kano, Nigeria, students walked out of exams and poured into the streets, waving signs that read, "Kanu plus, Traoré, our voice." In Bamako, the letter was projected onto university walls by handmade projectors. In Kisangani, a history professor paused mid-lecture to read the letter aloud. By the final line, students were crying. Some knelt. Others stood and chanted, "We are not waiting for freedom, we are becoming it." WhatsApp telegram signal all erupted. The letter was translated into Hausa, Lingala, Yoruba, and French. Young people felt something they had never felt before. We are not crazy for dreaming. In Dakar, a young woman climbed a statue and shouted, "They called us lazy. They called us divided." But Kanu was silent, and Traoré answered, "Now it's our turn." Governments panicked. Nigeria throttled the internet. ECOWAS released a statement dismissing the letter as foreign agitation. Côte d'Ivoire labeled it dangerous propaganda. But every voice raised to deny it was drowned in street chants, bootleg recordings, and candlelit songs. And in every chant, one name returned again and again, Ibrahim Traoré. Not as a ruler, but as a reflection. He didn't command, he didn't ascend, he stood beside. In Addis Ababa, the African Union called an emergency summit. Heads of state arrived, flanked by bodyguards and carefully crafted speeches. But none of them were prepared for what came next. Ibrahim Traoré walked to the center of the chamber and placed a single envelope on the table. "This is the voice you tried to bury. Read it not with your eyes, but with your conscience." No one spoke, no one moved. One by one, ministers leaned in to read. Outside, massive screens didn't broadcast debates or declarations, but the letter itself. Meanwhile, Nnamdi Kanu remained imprisoned. No one freed him, no one apologized. But something fundamental had shifted, not the chains, but the silence. It cracked, in Lagos, in Accra, in Niamey. Young voices no longer whispered his name, they shouted it. A continent that had forgotten how to speak to itself was now roaring, unified, unashamed, and unstoppable. Nnamdi Kanu was still there, inside a small windowless cell. The lights never turned off. Chains clinked with every shift of the guards. There was no grand rescue, no dropped charges. But something had happened, something even his captors hadn't anticipated. He didn't need to be freed to be free, because now freedom wore the faces of those outside the students in the streets. The mothers with candles, the journalists printing his letter, and one man in particular, Ibrahim Traoré. As the African Union scrambled to draft a neutral statement, 3 nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, refused to sign. In Nigeria, a senator resigned live on national television, holding up the letter and quoting, "Kanu, you see prisons. We see blueprints." It was no longer just a letter, it had become a compass. In the days that followed, graffiti began to bloom across city walls, Kanu standing in shadow, with a flaming map of Africa behind him. A new symbol appeared, just a single exclamation mark. It meant one thing: answer. The letter was printed into flyers, slipped into textbooks, as reading comprehension under language of resistance. Indie musicians began turning Kanu's words into lyrics, singing them in every language they knew. Kanu didn't know all of this, but he felt it. Every time a guard left a radio playing near his cell, he'd catch a sentence, a phrase, a line. His words. Not by name, but by fire. He didn't beg. He didn't complain. He just sat and kept writing as if the walls themselves were pages waiting to be filled. If they kill me, let them do it in daylight. Let the sun burn their shame into the bones of history. Ibrahim Traoré never stayed silent. In every speech that followed, he referred to the one who wrote in silence. When asked at a G5 Sahel meeting whether the letter really came from Kanu Traoré, answered what matters is not who wrote it, but who answered. A new generation had arrived, not born of slogans but of action, not for a single hero, but because they realized we are not alone in our dreaming, and that's what made it unstoppable. This wasn't a revolution with borders, no uniforms, no flags, just truth moving from hand to hand like fire. Kanu had written, "I do not write to glorify death. I write because I have lived a life worth dying for." Now, from Dakar to Lusaka, from student dorms to street corners, young people were living the next chapter of that letter. And if you're reading this now, you are part of it. Don't just scroll. Don't treat this as just another story. If it stirred something in you, do something. Share it. Pass it on. Don't let the fire die in you. Because as Kanu wrote, "If I disappear, let the world become my voice." This is not the ending. It is a handover. The fire is no longer in courtrooms, no longer in prison. It's in your hands now. In the days that followed, a strange quiet fell over the palaces and parliaments of West Africa. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that settles just before a storm. In Abuja, President Tinubu stopped appearing in public. His aides no longer smiled before the cameras. Reports said he spent nights pacing alone, watching news clips from Bamako, Dakar, and Kano, not for policy updates, but for faces, young faces, unfamiliar faces, faces that now burned with something far more dangerous than anger belief. Everywhere the letter had landed, it didn't act like propaganda, it acted like oxygen. University students who had never known the name Nnamdi Kanu now whispered it like scripture. In mosques and churches, preachers read lines from the letter between verses. And in homes where mothers once told their children to keep their heads down, a new refrain echoed at dinner tables. They tried to bury him, but now he's everywhere. The Nigerian state responded first with fear disguised as policy. Internet blackouts swept through Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Enugu. Radio stations were audited. Community leaders were visited by men in sunglasses who said nothing, but showed photos of gatherings and printouts of tweets. Still, it changed nothing. Because by then the letter was no longer digital, it was lived. Children in Makurdi chalked its words onto the walls of abandoned buildings. Teenagers in Ibadan stitched them into fabric patches for their backpacks. Farmers in the north, illiterate by circumstance, asked their sons to read it aloud by firelight. And for the first time in decades, people didn't talk about elections. They talked about meaning. In Burkina Faso, President Traoré refused to issue an official response. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any decree. When asked by a foreign journalist whether the letter represented a danger to national security, Traoré replied with a half smile, "Truth only threatens those who build with lies." At the African Union headquarters, tension simmered like a kettle with no lid. Some called the letter incendiary, others labeled it fake. Still, others asked what frightened them most, the fact that it was written or the fact that it was heard. In a closed-door meeting, one Central African diplomat slammed his fist on the table. "We control the banks, the roads, the armies, and yet we tremble. Because of ink on paper, no one had an answer. Because the ink had already bled through the borders." In Togo, a group of high schoolers refused to sing the national anthem until someone read the letter aloud. In Gambia, a radio host was suspended for quoting Kanu on air. She returned the next day with a new name, Voice of the Unforgotten. Her listenership tripled overnight. And in the streets of Libreville, Gabon, something unprecedented happened. A group of market women, mothers, widows, traders, walked together down the main boulevard, not in protest, but in unity. They said nothing. They carried nothing. They simply wore shirts that bore a single line, "I answered." By then, every government in West Africa had issued internal memos about monitoring unrest. But they couldn't find the unrest because it wasn't in the form of mobs or riots. It was in whispers, in quiet refusals, in poetry read at funerals, in songs hummed beneath breath in police stations. It was in the decision of a young woman to say no to silence and yes to risk. Even in France, the former colonial center, the letter reached African diaspora communities with the force of a tidal wave. In Marseille, Burkinabe students gathered outside their consulate not to demand, but to declare, "This is the voice that was stolen. We came to return it." In Paris, a Cameroonian filmmaker stopped post-production on a Netflix documentary to start a new project titled simply The Letter. It would never be nominated for awards, but it would be downloaded 6 million times in 1 week. At night, inside his cell, Nnamdi Kanu could not know all of this, but he felt it. The guards watched him differently now. Not with pity, with worry, because a man who sleeps peacefully in a cage is not afraid. He is planning. One afternoon, the prison chaplain visited Kanu with a Bible. He offered to read Psalms. Kanu declined gently and said, "No need. I've become a psalm." Outside, the world was moving faster than the old powers could contain, and the more they tried to stop it, the more it spread. Because the letter was never about one man's imprisonment. It was about the bars we all pretend not to see. It was about the debts disguised as development, the flags waving over mines, dug by foreign hands, the speeches about unity spoken by leaders who never leave their compounds. It was about the wound beneath the continent's smile, and the hand, however trembling, that dared to press against it and say, "We still feel it." And as the sun set over Ouagadougou 1 week later, President Ibrahim Traore stood again this time, before a gathering of women leaders. He held no speech. He held the original letter in his hand. He looked around the room and said, "This was not a call to war. It was a call to remember, and those who remember cannot be ruled the same way." There was no applause, just silence. And then a single woman rose. She had lost her son in the 2014 uprisings. Her voice shook as she spoke. "When my child died, I buried his body, but not his voice. Today I hear it again, in this letter." That night, in cities across Africa, bonfires were lit, not in anger, but in vigil. They called it the night of answering, because no matter what came next, one thing was certain: the silence had been broken, and once truth speaks, it cannot be unheard. Not all revolutions begin in the streets. Some begin in mess halls, in barracks where radios hum low and boots remain unlaced. In the days after Nnamdi Kanu's letter reached Ouagadougou, something curious began to unfold, not just among students and activists, but among those who were trained not to feel the soldiers. In Mali, a junior officer named Abdoulaye had always considered politics a language for men in suits. He wore a uniform. He followed orders. But on a Wednesday evening, while cleaning his weapon, he heard something on a crackling radio, a voice reciting the letter. He paused, then replayed it, then again. By morning, Abdoulaye had copied the final paragraph onto the inside of his locker. "If I disappear, let the world become my voice." He wasn't alone. Across barracks in Niamey, Bobo Dioulasso, and even Freetown soldiers began quoting the letter in private. Some wrote it in notebooks. Others carved initials KT for Kanu Traoré onto wooden desks. It was quiet, almost invisible, but real. Something was shifting, not rebellion, recognition. Because many of them, like Kanu, like Traoré, were children of villages erased from history books. Many had watched family members disappear without explanation. Some had once been the youth who believed. And now, with a letter, they remembered what belief felt like. One lieutenant in the Gambia was reported for asking during a drill, "Do we protect a state or a people?" No one answered, but the question hung in the air like incense lingering. Meanwhile, the international press began circling like vultures, unsure whether to mock or magnify the letter. The New York Times called it a well-crafted emotional appeal. Le Monde speculated if the author was really Kanu at all. CNN ran a 3-minute segment, but focused mostly on Traoré's anti-Western posture. No outlet dared to say what was becoming obvious: something irreversible had begun. Yet the mainstream headlines didn't matter, because another press had taken over the underground media of the people. Podcasts sprang up overnight. One, titled Letters from the Cage, featured daily readings of Kanu's letter in various local dialects. Its intro theme was a soft drum beat over which a woman's voice whispered, "You cannot silence a river." In Lagos, teenage coders created a mobile app called Answer. Its only function to deliver daily push notifications of one sentence from Kanu's letter, randomly selected. Within 72 hours, it had over 2 million downloads across West Africa. The letter wasn't trending, it was transforming. In villages, elders spoke of Sankara again, but not as nostalgia, as continuity. A man with integrity had reached into the past to awaken a future. In towns where politics had always arrived, wearing foreign ties, here now was a vision written in dirt, sweat, and truth. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's team noticed a spike in volunteers for youth training programs, not just in security but in agriculture infrastructure education. One official asked a group of applicants why they came. The youngest boy, barely 17, replied, "Because I want to be the sentence that changes everything." In Abuja, a secret memo leaked from inside the presidency. The subject line read, "Uncontrolled narrative, urgent containment required." The document listed threats including unregulated youth media, military officers, referencing foreign correspondents, increased attendance at unsanctioned vigils. The solution: restore narrative dominance via controlled inspiration platforms. In plain terms, manufacture hope to replace real hope. So influencers were paid to post vague slogans. Africa Rising United, we move, trust your leaders. Music stars were invited to perform at state-sponsored unity concerts. Some accepted. Others refused silently but clearly. And in the background, the real song kept playing. A chorus not backed by producers, but by pain, by love, by memory. In South Africa, students at the University of Cape Town projected a holographic version of the letter across the library walls. A professor was suspended for facilitating it. He returned the next day with a new title scrawled in chalk: Librarian of the Unwritten. In the streets of Kigali, Rwanda, where fear often swallowed dissent, a woman was seen giving away handwritten copies of the letter. When asked why she took the risk, she said, "Because my daughter must know that silence is not always safety." And in the diaspora, from London to Atlanta to Amsterdam, the letter became something else entirely: a passport. Not a document that grants travel, but one that grants belonging. Children of immigrants who had felt detached from home now read the letter as a map back to who they were. Artists began painting murals. One showed a chain shattering into a quill. Another, Kanu and Traoré, walking barefoot across a burning map of Africa. In Lomé, a school teacher assigned her students to write their own letters to the future. One girl wrote, "When they ask me who I am, I will not say poor. I will not say refugee. I will say the child of a continent that remembered its voice." And that was it. The fire wasn't in the courtrooms, not even in the prisons. It was in the hands of those who had once been told, "Your voice is too small." Now those voices were thunder. 3 weeks had passed. Not a single bullet had been fired. Not a single election overturned. Yet Africa had never felt so close to eruption, not of war, but of awakening. In cities across the continent, from Nairobi to Conakry, a silent calendar had formed each day, counted not from the birth of a prophet or fall of a government, but from the moment Kanu's letter left his hand. That was day 0. By day 21, something unprecedented was planned, not by governments but by people. It began with whispers on encrypted chats, one voice, 1 hour, one continent. And then it spread. Posters slid under cafe doors, radio hosts ending shows with the phrase, "We answer soon," WhatsApp groups sending only a single emoji. They called it the quiet uprising. No barricades, no marching orders, Just a simple idea on the same day at the same hour across all time zones of Africa. Every person who had read or heard the letter would stop, stand, and hold silence. 1 minute. For those erased. For those still caged. For those who answered. Governments panicked. Preemptive arrests were made. Warnings broadcast. Borders tightened. Schools threatened with expulsion if any student participated. But fear arrived too late, because the idea wasn't physical. It was already alive in minds, in songs, in every whisper that had refused to die. And so on day 22, it happened. 11:00 a.m. GMT, a continent held its breath. In marketplaces of Burkina Faso, the rhythm of buying and selling froze. Women dropped baskets and stood heads high, lips sealed. In Lagos, traffic drivers killed their engines. Motorcycles coasted to silence. Hawkers put down goods and turned their eyes to the sky. In Johannesburg, students placed printed copies of the letter across campus benches, unmoving. In Mogadishu, even those in refugee camps paused, fists pressed to hearts' eyes shut. Across the sea, the diaspora followed. In New York, Africans at Columbia University formed a silent circle. In London, Hyde Park echoed with silence as hundreds gathered, not shouting, not marching, just remembering. For 60 seconds, the world watched something it could not define. CCTV footage from ECOWAS headquarters showed staff members stopping mid-task, unsure if they were witnessing a breakdown or a birth. Journalists had no script. Analysts had no words, and still no declaration was made. No leader claimed it, because it didn't belong to one man, not even to Kanu, not even to Traoré. But somewhere in that moment, Nnamdi Kanu was listening. He couldn't see the streets, but he heard it in the echo of boots that stopped pacing. He felt it in the hesitation of guards, and then for the first time since his imprisonment began, the lights in his cell flickered off. Darkness, not imposed, gifted. He laughed not with sarcasm but with clarity, for he knew. They had stopped surveilling him not because he no longer mattered, but because he had already become the spark. That night in the heart of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore walked alone to the square. No bodyguards, no speeches. He simply placed a lantern on the ground beside a stone, engraved with one word answer. He knelt, lit the flame, and whispered. He wrote in silence. We answered in silence. Now, let the silence speak for itself. International reaction came fast and hollow. The African Union issued a statement of concern. The IMF called for restored confidence. France offered humanitarian support for freedom of expression. None of it mattered, because the next morning, students in 30 countries refused to attend classes unless Kanu's letter was added to national literature curricula. By the end of the week, 2 heads of state had resigned, not from pressure, from irrelevance. In Ghana, a poet was elected mayor after publishing a reply to Kanu's letter in 6 languages. In Niger, retired colonels began teaching civic duty in rural schools, free of charge. And in Enugu, where the courier who carried Kanu's letter once lived, a statue was erected not of him, but of a hand releasing a page into the wind. The plaque read, "Some chains are broken from the outside, others from within." Nnamdi Kanu remained behind bars. He never escaped. But he was no longer waiting. He had become a page that wrote itself. And across Africa, in the hum of midnight radios, in chalk on school walls, in lullabies, hummed by mothers who once feared their sons would be forgotten, one line returned again and again: if I disappear, let the world become my voice. And it did. We once believed that freedom was a destination. But after that letter, after the deafening silence that echoed across the continent, we realized freedom is not a place we arrive at. Freedom is what we become. Nnamdi Kanu still sits in a windowless room. The lights never go out. The chains still rattle with every step of the guards. But the world no longer sees him as a prisoner. He is a mirror, and in it, every young African now sees a reflection of themselves. We don't need a dramatic rescue to know he is already free. Because now that freedom lives in the whispers of a Nigerian mother, in the eyes of a student in Dakar, in the flame lit by Traoré, without a single speech. Truth once spoken from the mouth of a shackled man cannot be captured again. And those who thought they had extinguished the dream can now only watch as it rises from the grave through voices, through images, through the silence that refuses to submit. If you are still reading, then you are no longer just an observer. You are now part of this story. Hold the fire, pass it on, and if one day silence begins to return again, remember there was once a man who wrote, and an entire continent answered,